Lent is really meant to be a time of self-examination, a time of commitment, not just to God, but to the poor and the needy and those who are in need.
You are listening to Practice Not Perfect, a podcast about spiritual practice that is rooted in the Christian spiritual tradition. I'm your host, James Adams. What is Lent and how do we practice it? Is it just about giving up chocolate or Facebook or some other habit that we probably should give up anyway? Or is it something deeper? I got to sit down with Christine Sine to discuss what is Lent and how do we practice. Here is our conversation. Hello, I'm here with Christine Sine, whom I've never met, although I can say for a fact that I have been in the same room as you because I've been at an Inhabit conference when you were there. And I've been a long-time reader of your God Space site, which people can find at godspacelight.com. And over there, you have a number of resources that I would love for people to check out. You have prayers and articles about all kinds of stuff. By way of introduction to our listeners, I'll say that you describe yourselves as a contemplative activist, a passionate gardener, an author, and a liturgist, or I'm maybe a liturgical rebel, we should say. And you were co-founder with your husband, Tom Sine, of the Mustard Seed Associates. People will know the name Tom Sine from his book, Mustard Seed Conspiracy, and a number of others, but he kind of spearheaded kind of a movement that I think kind of predates and prefigures things like the new monasticism of how we kind of challenge empire and systems of economic inequity and consumption and all that stuff. And you are very much involved in that work. You've written several books of your own. Is Rest in the Moment your most recent one, or?
No, The Gift of Wonder.
The Gift
Well,
of
actually, it's not even my most recent. That's probably the one that I focus on the most. But the most recent one is Digging Deeper, The Art of Contemplative Gardening.
Yeah. Actually, I've listed all of those. So Rest in the Moment, Reflections for Godly Pauses, The Gift of Wonder, Creative Practices for Delighting God, and Digging Deeper, The Art of Contemplative Gardening.
Yes.
And a book of yours that you wrote with Tom that I've read is The Living on Purpose. So,
yes.
So there are others we could probably list. And as I said, you've written prolifically on a whole bunch of stuff on your website, including Celtic Christian spirituality, spiritual direction, creativity, simplicity, sustainability. It's a wonderful site. So
thank you.
So welcome. And I invited you on because I want to talk about Lent. And I did an episode about Advent when Advent started, because I think it's one of those seasons that we want to understand more as we try to practice that. And I thought, who could I talk to? And I'm like, well, Christine Sine, that would be wonderful. So I'm excited to get into that. I'll say right now, we are in a season that some Christians call ordinary time as we record this, and some call Epiphany. And one of the things that I picked up from you several years ago was the chalking of the door on Epiphany. So I think about that, and we did that this year with a kind of a simple liturgy as a family. And it's fun.
It's fun practice.
It is really fun. It's funny that I only had big sidewalk chalk this year, so I ended up writing it kind of big, and I did it on the inside of the door. Because then we can actually see it. Our door hides it a little bit. So I like to begin, before we get into our discussion, with a couple of practice questions. And by this is like practice questions about what we practice. So Christine, what is one thing that you have practiced a lot of in your life. It doesn't have to be a spiritual practice. It could be a skill that you learned, an instrument you played, a hobby that you really enjoy, or a sport that you played when you were younger. Anything that you've practiced.
Well, I'd have to say gardening. Well, probably two things: gardening and what I call awe and wonder walks. Which in some ways came out of my gardening, because I grew up gardening a little bit, but it was when I came here to Seattle and settled in Seattle that I really got into gardening. And when I started to recognize the ways that God and the story of God is lived out in the garden. So that kind of, in a way, started my awe and wonder walks, because I'd walk around and I'd look at the wonderful things that God had created, and I'd reflect on them, and what do they reveal to me about God, about what do they reveal to me about the story of God. And it's something that I've done now for a lot of years, and it becomes more and more important to me the older I get, I think. Just recognizing and taking time to enter into the awe and wonder of God in the world around us.
Oh, that's really neat. I was the awe and wonder walks. I would think about hiking.
Uh-huh.
And then when I was a younger person, hiking, I would try to be the first person to the summit or the end point of whatever. I would just kind of rush through. But several years ago, a pastor friend of mine taught me to recognize the wildflowers.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now it's a slow journey through to recognize all that is there.
The other question I like to ask is, what's one thing that you used to practice, but you no longer practice?
Oh, I would say reading the Bible every day.
Okay.
As a young Christian, I literally would read through the Bible every year.
Mm-hmm.
And for most of my life, I have read the Bible every day. But I think in the last few years, I don't read the Bible every day. I'm more likely to, sometimes I will focus on a verse, or I will focus on the concept of God, and I will spend time meditating and contemplating rather than necessarily feeling I have to read the Bible. Now, I do read the Bible regularly. In fact, I just got a new Bible that I'm looking forward to getting into, but it's not something I feel I have to do every day anymore.
Yeah. When I'm feeling provocative, I always like to press people that the Bible never says to read the Bible every day.
Yes.
It says meditate on it at night. That's a whole different thing, and might include reading, but it includes a whole list of other things of inhabiting the word.
Yes.
All right. So real basically, what is Lent?
Well, Lent is a period of 40 days of preparation for Easter. Now, if you look at Lent, like this year, it actually starts on February 14th, Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
And Easter is, what is it? It's the last day of
March.
And if you count the number of days that there are in what is called Lent, you'll notice that there are actually more than 40 days. And one of the reasons for that is that we don't practice Lent on Sundays. That's always a kind of a pause from Lent. So Lent is 40 days of preparation. So it's the 40 days going from Ash Wednesday, which is the beginning of Lent, to Good Friday, but not including the Sundays in that time. Right. And when I say preparation, it was a time which we think of traditionally as giving up things for Lent. The day before Ash Wednesday is called Shrove Tuesday, because traditionally people made pancakes because they would use up the stuff that they weren't allowed to eat during Lent. And the Lenten diet was, fairly strict. But I think that, it's become, the whole thing of giving up for me is a little frustrating. I know so many people that give up chocolate for Lent, and it's like it trivializes Lent as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
because I think Lent is really meant to be a time of self-examination, a time of commitment, not just to God, but to the poor and the needy and those who are in need of God's presence in their lives, not just in a spiritual way, but in a physical way as well. And we are meant to be God's representatives in this world. And Lent is meant to be a time of preparing us to really be the people of God in this world. And so examining ourselves of how well do we do is something that I like to do. I did a booklet for Lent a number of years ago now called Hungering for Lent. And, it looks at the aspects, it looks at justice, it looks at spirituality, it looks at concern for nature, and kind of looking at some of the areas that I feel that we should really be examining during the season of Lent. Now, that's my personal feeling. I tend to kind of think a little bit outside the boxes, and that's kind of part of that.
Yeah.
But interestingly, just one more little thing. One of the things that I've discovered several years ago is that the time of Lent coincides with what used to be the hunger season in most of the Northern Hemisphere. This was the time between, before the new crops came in. And if people hadn't stored enough crops, then they would often have to go without during this season, not because they were practicing Lent, but because they'd run out of supplies.
Mm.
And from a little that I've read, I think that Lent began in some ways part of Lent was an identification with those who didn't have anything, and meant to kind of share with those that didn't have anything during that time as well.
That's fascinating.
Isn't it? Mhm.
I've never heard that, but it makes so much sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Uh,
And I think, the typical Lenten diet was lentils and beans and things like that. And I think that is probably all that people had often by that time of the year, and it was a necessity rather than anything else, but it was something that did help people. The wealthy obviously had plenty of other things, but it was asking them to come down to the level of the poor and to identify with them during this season.
yeah. Well, so that puts a whole different spin on giving things up.
Yes, yes.
So I always laugh when people like give up chocolate because they're giving up something that they think that they shouldn't have a lot of anyway, and that is really a different energy. It's more like what people do with New Year's resolutions, like positive change, but they're not thinking about the wider community, which is with that history of the hunger season, that puts a different spin. I think one year my wife and I gave up meat for Lent, but we did it with the intention of really thinking of food systems in our country and how they're often unjust, and there's genetic farming, but there's also just the ways that farmers are put into debt with this industrial style of farm. And so thinking about our complicity in the systems, and so that was a meaningful Lent for us. We're not totally plant-based now, but it did help shape our thinking on stuff in a way that we're still trying to live out. So
oh, that's a great thing to do. One thing we did for several years was living on $2 a day for Lent. For food, restricting our food budget to $2 per person per day.
Yeah, I have friends that have done that, and wow, I mean, especially where food prices are going, that seems almost.
Well, in these days, of course, it's a lot harder than it was when we did it probably 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But even so, I mean, I learned a lot through it. Firstly, kind of, simplicity, but also we grow a lot of our own fruit and vegetables. And of course, we could eat out of the garden and it didn't cost anything for us, so it could supplement that $2 a day. And I thought, wow, when people have the opportunity to eat out of their own gardens, that really makes a huge difference to them. And it made me recognize why so often urban poverty is a much greater problem than rural poverty, because people who live in rural areas and are poor can often at least supplement their diet with food out of their gardens.
Yeah.
But people that live in the cities, they usually can't do that, so it was I learned a lot through that practice that we
Yeah.
engaged in.
You can't garden as much in the city. You can do a little.
No,
You can't forage for anything in the city, or I wouldn't
no,
recommend it.
no, that's for sure. Though people do dumpster dive, that maybe that's the foraging equivalent in the urban situation.
But you're touching on something that, because there is this positive aspect to the tradition around Lent of not just giving something up, but also, I think traditionally they would say almsgiving, like
Yes.
doing something to help your neighbor. And that's something that culturally is not picked up as much.
No, it's easier to give something up, particularly when it's something that in some ways doesn't really make an enormous difference to us, than it is to reach out and do something that puts us outside our comfort boxes.
Yeah.
Which I think is what a lot of what Lent was meant to be about. It was meant to put us outside our comfort boxes physically and spiritually in a lot of ways, reaching out to people that we didn't normally reach out to, kind of learning spiritual disciplines that we didn't always adhere to, and things like that as well, I think is a lot of what Lent is meant to be about.
In a way, I think Lent is a special season in that, Advent is also this preparatory season that's penitential, and yet like it gets kind of squeezed in our contemporary setting of you're preparing for Christmas and have to do all your shopping, and
Yes.
sometimes things can get lost there a little bit. But Lent, it feels like if somebody has a spiritual practice, they see this season as a time to deepen it.
I think that's a very good thing to think of. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and can I just comment in terms of Advent too?
Yeah.
One of the things that we do is that we celebrate Celtic Advent, which, like Lent, is a 40-day preparation for Christmas. It starts on November 15th. It always starts on the same day. Whereas the traditional Western Advent, which starts, at a variable time, this last year was very, very short.
Yeah.
Yeah. And having those couple of weeks longer, I find, is wonderful, because it means that you can kind of get your focus before all the hype really starts up for Christmas. And so it's something that I would recommend, because I think that 40 days that we have for Lent is there for a purpose, because I think in some ways it takes that long. We've got to change gear to a certain extent. We've got to really focus in. And I think having that same kind of an approach to Advent is something that I found very helpful.
Yeah. I just popped in my head while you were talking is, how they used to say, like, it takes 6 weeks to solidify a habit. I mean, that's what we do in Lent, but you can do that for Advent too. That's a different thing in terms of.
Yes. No, I think it's true. I think it does take that length of time. And I think that's part of the reason that, this, even though they didn't have the scientific evidence to say this is how long it takes to change a habit, I think that there was that intuitive kind of understanding that it takes this length of time to change a habit.
Yeah. So probing Lenten practice, I guess I could ask, like, what are some ways that you would suggest that if somebody's interested in practicing Lent, what are some things we can do?
Well, I do something different every year. One of the things that I like to do, because it provides a focus for me, is that I create contemplative gardens. And I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for Lent. And this is a small garden, something about this, maybe 12 inches across. The purpose of this is to provide a focus. So it'll have plants in it. It'll sometimes have other objects that kind of help me think about the season and really provide a focus. So the first thing I would say is, find a focus and have something visual that helps you to focus in on that you can look at on a regular basis. Because I think that, if we start with, oh, I'm going to read the scripture, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that, it's so easy to let it kind of get out, kind of go through it for 5-10 minutes, and then it's gone. Whereas if you have some kind of a visual focus, and, you may not be a gardener like me, you may not want that, but I've had times when I'll redecorate my sacred space as well. I'll put up symbols. I'll start to put up my crosses for, the season of Lent. And again, that provides a focus. I've got several crosses, and I'll put those around my area that I spend a lot of my time. So that's number one. Secondly, I would say choose a theme. What is it that you'd really like to focus in on during the season of Lent? Is it the people around you who are in need? And choose a focus that is not just an inward focus, but is an outward focus as well. I talk about myself as a contemplative activist, and I feel that our times of contemplation are meant to prepare us to be more active out in the world. And so I think as you choose a focus, and as you choose a focus, I think that's what we should be aiming at. What is a focus that we can have during the season of Lent that really, really will help us to be more active out in the world? And, that can be anything, because I think that the challenge of Lent is not just to kind of accept what everybody else says this is meant to be about, but really to take some time at the beginning of the season to say, what is it that God wants me to focus on during this season? What is meant to be my focus? How can I use that as a focus for contemplation? How can I then use that as something to spur me into activity out into the world? As you can see, I take a different approach to these seasons. I call myself a liturgical rebel, which is the name of the podcast I'm just starting. And part of it is because I really feel that we need an embodied faith that gets us out into the world. We're not just about inner practices. We're not meant to be about inner practices. The early church grew because it reached out, from what I understand. It didn't grow because people became holier inside. It grew because that holiness was expressed out in the world around them. And I think that, that combination is what God calls us to. And that's part of what I want to focus on in the podcast that I'm starting, is helping people think about what are practices, what are ways to burst outside the boxes that we've kind of put around spiritual practices and prepare ourselves in a way that is much more effective in the world in which we live today.
Ooh, that's wonderful and exciting. I can't wait to listen to your podcast, which you mentioned before we started recording. It's launching really soon.
Really soon, yes, in the next week or two. But just getting all the preliminary stuff done takes longer than I realized, and but it's coming. It's coming.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited about that. Can I just circle back here? I mean, you said first, like, creating an image for your Lenten experience. We do this in other seasons, like Advent, when you put the Christmas tree up, it does change the environment a little bit, but this is taking images and taking environments and kind of shifting where our focus is, and then the focusing on a theme. If I can say also, with the focus image, this could be as simple as if somebody wanted to do a spiritual practice of devotional reading or Lectio Divina or something, of creating a space for that.
Yes.
So that they can experience God in that moment in a way that shows intention.
Yes.
And so I think that is something that makes a lot of sense, and it's not something that people necessarily think about this time of year. So
Yeah.
I appreciate
No, it's true. You don't. But we live in a very visual world. You
that.
know, everything provides images for us. And if we don't have an image that helps us kind of focus in on the meaning for the season, we're so much more easily distracted by all the images around us. You know, that's part of what I find with having the kind of redoing my sacred space and having images to focus in on, is that it helps keep out the distractions, you know. And I do like using a devotional as well, though, you know, sometimes again I don't always read it every day,
Sure.
but you know, but that comes out of my focus. So I've read, you know, devotionals that kind of focus on creation and the destruction of creation.
Mm,
No, and that would be my focus. Or I've read sometimes devotionals that focus on the injustices in our world.
yeah.
I think Walter Brueggemann is a great one
Mhm.
for that. You know, I can't think off the top of my head of the name of his Lenten book, but it's an excellent one
Okay.
to look at. I've used that 2 or 3 times. So choosing a focus and then choosing a devotional, I think, is a way that I would suggest that people go. You know, do you want to think about the climate change and destruction of our, you know, physical environment around us? Find a book that focuses on that. Do you want to focus on the injustices in our world? You know, find a book that focuses on that. So tailor your devotional book to what it is that you really want to reflect on during this season.
Yeah. When you talk about the suffering of creation, it was Gail Boss is the one I was thinking of.
Yes, that's the one that
Yeah.
I read. That, and then there was another one that I've read as well, but I just can't think of the name. But yeah, there are several out there now. I mean, it's something that I think is becoming more and more of a focus for people. And I think
Uh,
it's something that is worth thinking about.
just an amusing anecdote, but is that like we love her Advent devotional as a family, and it comes out every year. And which is her Advent devotional is All Creation Waits, and it's about
Yes, it's very good.
animals in their waiting space. We did the Wild Hope, which is her
Her Lenten one, yeah.
Lenten one year, and I love it, but it is hard to hear some of those stories, and my kids never wanted to read it ever again.
Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah.
was a tough one for us as a family, because you think
Uh-huh.
about all of the ways that animals suffer in our modern world.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and it is tough. I mean, if we really get into you know, the injustices, or, you know, the creation suffering in our world, it's tough. We don't want to, you know, kind of, and it can be overwhelming. And that's why, you know, I think I feel we need to think, okay, this is tough. This is overwhelming. What is one thing I might be able to do about this? Can
Mm,
offer, you know, a way to think about it too, you know. How can I join in what God is wanting to accomplish in terms of this? I often think that, you know, one of the challenges that we have is that we become so focused on the problem that we forget about the solutions, or we forget about what God is already doing. And a question that a friend of mine kind of pointed me to several years ago was, what she asks when she's praying is, what is God up to? You know, a situation she's praying for. What is God doing, and how can I join in?
mm,
And I love that. And I think as we read through these devotionals that can be very concerning
yeah.
and very challenging, you know, asking that question of what is God doing and where can I join in? I think is it means we finish with hope. And I think that is what God wants us to do, is to finish with hope rather than with despair. You know, but this Lent is about preparing us for the hope of Easter. And so it's really important to look in this direction.
Well, that is a brilliant way to frame it. What is God doing, and where can I join in? I mean,
Mhm.
this is a question that I wish people would ask more.
Well, it's not a question that's often asked. I started asking it, oh, a number of years ago now. Well, I remember when it was. It was the year that the earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand,
Mhm.
uh, where I'd lived for a couple of years. Then there was the tsunami in Japan. And then there was flooding in Brisbane in Australia, where my aunt lived on the river and her home was flooded.
Mhm.
And it was overwhelming. And and then I started to think, where is God in the midst of this? And my aunt told the story of these two total strangers who came from Perth, which is on the other side of
Yeah.
Australia, to come and
Wow.
help her get things. And you think of the number of strangers that respond in the midst of disaster, and heard similar stories from Christchurch and from Japan. In fact, they had to turn away in Japan. They had to say no more helpers because there were so many people that wanted to come and help. And so often, if we focus just on the disaster, then we miss what it is that God is doing. And I think, each of these people, maybe they don't call themselves Christian, they don't even call themselves religious, but they respond out of what I think is the spark of God buried within them.
Mm.
Uh, and and that is, part of what the season's about. It's kind of igniting that spark of God within us to say, oh, I've got to respond. I've got to do something about it as well.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Thank you. I'm passionate about these things. I like to look at them from different perspectives rather than same old, same old. I want us to think outside the box and to consider, because we should be more invested in the world than we are.
We're talking a little bit about personal practices for Lent and personal practices that affect the wider community. But what are some communal practices that we can do for Lent?
Uh, wow. Well, obviously, the thing that people do is soup suppers. But, which I think is great. I think that having a time when we come together around a simple meal and, kind of and discuss some of these issues. I mean, I wouldn't just do it with a soup supper, but, if we're focusing on climate change during Lent, what are some things that we can talk about during that simple supper that can help prepare us for action or help prepare our church for action? If we're concerned about injustice against Black people in our community, making those soup suppers a kind of a focus for discussion, of something that can be outwardly focused then is a practice that I really like. And I've seen a few churches that have done that. But often, the focus of the soup supper is pretty much inward. But I think it should be outward, get us out there, help to prepare us to get out there and to get involved in some way in the issue that we're really focusing on during the Lenten season.
Yeah. Yeah, I've done the soup suppers at my church, or soup lunch is, but it has been this more inward focus, which isn't all bad. I mean,
No, well, we need both,
yeah,
need both. Yes.
yeah. What one year during Lent we did a book. It was called Good Enough by Kate Bowler. That's her name. She wrote a book about how we're good enough.
Mhm.
And that was a really interesting space to be in for Lent, where a lot of times, at least in the tradition that I grew up in, this was the time for heroic discipline and to remind people that they need to repent. Uh,
Mhm.
and it was such a different focus, in that it was like, we had a book study, or I wouldn't even say study. We just say, tell people, read whatever you want to read from the book and come and we'll talk about it.
Mm.
and and so people came with different things, and we just had a way of talking about things that was really good, but it was just totally like inward focus. It
Mhm.
wasn't about how we step out. It was about how we can be more generous with ourselves and with one another, but which should have some sort of an outward focus. But that's different than wrestling with an issue.
Mhm. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Are there particular practices that nourish you, Christine, for your work?
Well, I think what I've talked about are definitely some of the nourishing practices. Another one that I've just started doing over the last few years is writing poetry.
Mm,
Uh, I find that poetry it kind of resonates in our souls, and I feel I mean, I started with reading poetry, but more recently I've been writing it as well, and I found that that's a very nourishing kind of a practice. But there are all kinds of things. Another thing I do that is really, again, I'm very much into embodied practices, and I paint rocks.
mm.
Don't do the very good job of it necessarily, but just focusing in on something like that as a contemplative practice is really helpful from my perspective. And I like those things that they nourish my soul. They kind of help make the connection between my brain and my heart, I think. And so those are the kinds of things that I really find effective for me.
I could just echo that, is that somehow putting a paintbrush in your hand is a contemplative practice that does kind of what you were suggesting for Lent, is it gives you a focus, a focus image, and it embodies contemplation in a way that we tend to think of contemplation as internal, but
Yeah.
um,
Well, and this is what my book, The Gift of Wonder, is
yeah.
about. Basically, I take 12 practices, or 12 focuses. It starts with, what, God said, well, Jesus saying, unless we become like children, we cannot enter the kingdom. And so looking at what are the attributes of childhood that make us fit for the kingdom. So I go through and I look at gratitude, playfulness, imagination, hospitality. I take 12 and look at those. And each chapter has several exercises in it, usually one at the end. But, I talk about things that I've done and that other people have done. And I think bringing that practicality into our faith is something that is very important for us as well. And certainly during Lent, what are the practical ways that we can get into the subject that we're concerned about this year, rather than just reading a devotional? Because I think that, I think images have more of an impact than words often, it says she as an author. But, kind of combining images and words is something that is very powerful, I feel. And so that's something that I really encourage people to do.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think the Reformation kind of destroyed for
Oh,
those of us who are Protestants, is the way that image and word were intertwined,
yes.
way that helps everyone who's visual or learns in different ways to kind of apprehend things.
Mhm. Well, you think, I'm very interested in Celtic Christian spirituality, and you look at the books that we have of what the monks did, and they didn't just write things. I mean, they had these amazing, visual images that went with their words. And I think, that's the way it was meant to be. And of course, I think the printing press, to a certain extent, it wasn't just the Reformation, but the printing press too. I mean, suddenly it just became words. We didn't kind of write the words ourselves and embellish them with beautiful kind of decorations and things like that. We just read the words.
Mm.
Yep. So I think that we lost something in the process. So, I mean, that's kind of another topic to talk about. But, really, we really did lose something in the process, I think.
Well, so as we kind of are wrapping things up here, where can people connect with you and your work? We mentioned your website at the beginning. God.
Godspacelight.com is my webspace.
Yeah.
I'm on Instagram and I'm on Facebook.
Mhm.
And I'm about to start a Substack letter as well. But at the moment, Instagram and Facebook. I'm also on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel, but I don't put stuff on that very often. I need to put up some more of my prayers, short meditations, but I just, with launching the podcast, haven't had time for that. So,
Well, my podcast goes to my YouTube channel, so you can probably set that up too. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sounds like a good idea. So, great.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Christine, and I look forward to entering this season of Lent and practicing, and thank you for the wonderful discussion today.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it. Thanks, James.
Christine said several things that I want to bring into my Lenten practice this year. Craft an environment or symbol that helps you remember the meaning of the season. Pick a theme to focus in on through all of Lent. Look outward and don't just focus on yourself. Ask what God is already doing in the world and where you can join to be a part of it. And lastly, end in hope. The season ends in resurrection, and that's what we are moving toward. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to hit like or subscribe. And please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And until next time, keep practicing.